All right, today is November the 7th. We are still studying the life of Elisha. We're coming back to that. Last week it was Reformation Sunday, but today we're going back to the life of Elisha, and we will be reading 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 18 through 37. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 18 through 37. And while you're turning there, I think I'm just going to take a moment and tell you a story that I found that was pretty funny. At least it was funny to me. This is an article from several years ago, about 5 years ago. But it was from Time Magazine, and the title is "Band Fan Goes to Great Lengths to Watch Soccer Game by Renting a Crane." And I won't read you the article. I'll just summarize it. There's a guy named Ali Demirkia in Turkey that evidently acted out at some games. I don't know. But he was banned from the Denizli Ataturk Stadium for the entire season. Can't come in. He had only one reasonable recourse then to watch the game. He rented a crane. He went just beyond the stadium limits, and then he got on the crane and he lifted it all the way up, and he was watching over the walls the game, and he even led the crowd in a chant. The internet called him Yamuk Ali, or Irregular Ali, because he just could not miss a game. I guess he was quite the oddball. That match is very important for our team. Irregular Ali told the newspaper. I had to go to the police station to sign a paper to show I'm not watching the match in the stadium. And that's when I went to rent the crane. It cost him about $86. And it was, he had a pretty good perch up there, evidently, where he could view the game. Of course, the police came before the next game and had him lower the crane. But I do find it interesting because it does raise an interesting question. When something is important to you, you do what it takes, don't you, to make sure that that what you need to have happen happens. In this case, it's watching a football game. But that's exactly the kind of situation we see in front of us, only the situation that we find is far more important than watching a football game. You might remember 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, we read this story that is immediately previous to this one. And in that story, Elisha stops by a little town in the north of Israel named Shunem. Evidently, Elisha regularly stopped by Shunem as he made a circuit throughout Israel. And as it happened, a wealthy woman in that town decided that she wanted him to stay at her house from then on. In fact, let's just go ahead and read that story. Verse 8 through 17. Bonnie, would you read that? 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 17.
One day, Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us. One day when Elisha came, he went up to his room and lay down there. He said to his servant Gehazi, call the Shunammite. So he called her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army? She replied, I have a home among my own people. What can be done for her? Elisha asked. Gehazi said, well, she has no son and her husband is old. Then Elisha said, call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha said, you will hold a son in your arms. No, my lord, she objected. Don't mislead your servant, O man of God. But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her.
All right, thank you, Bonnie. Now, you'll remember we said that the purpose of this story, remember whenever you read a Bible story, it's not just to read interesting stories, although the Bible is great literature, but it goes beyond that. The Bible always wants us to change our behavior. And so when we read a story in the Bible, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is it that this text wants me to do? I need to start doing something. I need to stop doing something, etc. And you'll recall that last time we were together, we said that the big idea for telling this story is found in Hebrews 11:35. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. Now, when you look in the book of Hebrews, the author wants us to learn from these heroes of faith. And the reason he does is because he wants us to have the same kind of faith ourselves. And so when we get to chapter 11, we have what many have called the Hall of Fame of Faith. He reminds us of all the things in the Old Testament, both good and bad, that resulted from faith. And then he says, I want you to apply this to your life. So that's our goal this morning. But this is the main idea, the big idea I want us to keep with us. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. James, you'll remember we talked about this week, how we always have one idea we want to communicate. Well, that's the idea here. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. Now, it's always good to outline. These passages so we can take them in bite-sized chunks and see them a little easier. So let's divide this story that we're about to read into 4 scenes. We see the son's death, verses 18 to 21. The son's death, 18 to 21. The woman's journey, verses 22 to 30. Gehazi's attempt, verse 31. And Elisha's miracle, verses 32 to 37. So the son's death, 18 to 21. The woman's journey, 22 to 30. Gehazi's attempt, verse 31. And Elisha's miracle, verses 32 through 37. So with that in mind, let's look first at the son's death, starting in verse 18 and continuing through verse 21. Bonnie?
The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. My head, he said to his father. His father told the servant, carry him to his mother. After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, then shut the door and went out.
Okay, now this is the part of the story that begins by indicating that a certain period of time has passed. We read that the child grew. We don't know how long. The last time we learned of this child, he was a baby in his mother's arms, but now he's old enough to walk out to his father in the fields. And we aren't told how old he is, but we do have a couple of clues. He's called a child in verses 30 and 31 and 35. We read this boy was carried to his mother in verse 20, and that he sat on her lap until noon when he died. So it seems likely that this boy was somewhere around the age of 4, 5, maybe as old as 6, something like that. Well, this little guy, like little boys everywhere, enjoyed watching the various activities around the farm. But on one of these days, he was out in the field and he complains of a severe headache. my head, he said to his father. And like most fathers anywhere, he sends the sick child to his mother. Now, other than a headache, we don't know the exact nature of the illness, but we do know the severity of the problem because he walked out to the field, but he was carried to his mother. Well, his mother, like mothers everywhere, tries to comfort her son, but there's little she can do. She holds the boy in her lap. She shushes his crying, rocking him back and forth until noon, when he dies in her arms. And really, you have to be made out of stone not to be heartbroken by this tender scene. And so far, at least, this story has played out as exactly as we would expect such a story to be played out. While this story is certainly moving and painful to behold, nothing all that unusual has taken place, at least not yet. Everybody acts as we would expect them to act. That is until we reach verse 21. We expect to read that the mother picks up her child, lays him on his little bed, sends word to the father that their only child has died. But that's not what happens. Instead, she picks up the child, she carries him to the roof, to that special room made specifically for the man of God, and she lays her dead child, her only child, the child promised to her by the man of God. She lays that child on Elisha's bed, then she shuts the door and goes out. Now, we don't know for certain what's going on through her mind, but I consider it likely that some vague notion that the prophet would be able to help has something to do with it. It's probable that she heard the story of Elijah and how he was staying with a widow in Zarephath, and how her son came to life during the famine. When the boy died, Elijah carried him to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on the bed, and that's where the miracle happened. And that's when the boy was brought back to life. So I don't consider it a coincidence that she reenacts this famous scene from 1 Kings 17. And in doing so, she shows her faith. Again, we don't know exactly what it is that she believed or she expected, but certainly she's expecting something out of the ordinary to happen. And it's that expectation that God is going to act in a way that goes beyond what you would normally expect. That expectation is what we call faith. And that's what we need to remember. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. That's what this story is teaching. Well, let's continue. We've seen the son's death. Let's look at the woman's journey, verses 22 to 30. Bonnie.
She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return." "Why go to him today?" he asked. "It's not the new moon or the Sabbath." "It's all right," she said. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, "Lead on. Don't slow down for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, there's the Shunammite. Run to meet her and ask her, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right?'" "Everything is all right," she said. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." "Did I ask you for a son, my lord?" she said. "Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Elisha said to Gehazi, "Tuck your cloak into your belt, take my staff in your hand, and run. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face." But the child's mother said, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So he got up and followed her.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. After lying the boy on Elisha's bed, she walks a little ways from her house and she calls out to her husband who's still in the field. The NIV, which we just read from, gives the impression that she called her husband to her. But the original language is pretty clear that she called out to her husband, indicating a long distance conversation. So she shouts to her husband in the field and asks her husband to send a servant with a donkey so that she can run to the man of God and return. And the thought is that the servant would lead the donkey while she sat on it for the journey. Now, it's at this point we see how clueless this husband is. One would think that he'd be able to intuit that a quick trip to the man of God would indicate a problem with his son, but he doesn't even ask about how his son is doing. All he wonders about is the timing of the trip. After all, it's not the new moon, it's not the Sabbath. That's when you go see the man of God, right? And I suppose in one respect, we really shouldn't be surprised by this attitude. This attitude is still alive and with us today. You probably are not aware, but Bonnie's father was a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor for as long as I knew him. And Bonnie and I were visiting somewhere, I don't remember, but Bonnie and I and Bonnie's mother were speaking of spiritual things when one of Bonnie's siblings said, "What are you talking about that now for? This isn't Sunday." That, by the way, is the wrong thing to say to your mother, who happens to be the pastor's wife. Let's just say that attitude got him pulled up short pretty quick. But in fairness, that's not a new attitude. This is the same attitude as the husband of this woman. There are certain times and certain places where we consider the things of God. But outside those certain times and certain places, we have no obligation whatsoever to seek God or his will. And this man just couldn't understand why his wife would want to go see the man of God outside one of these prescribed times. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, I find it interesting that he doesn't inquire about the health of the boy. I don't know for certain, but I find it possible that this is an indication of his lack of faith generally. We don't know the man's name. He's just a prop in this play almost. But if he had really believed that the man of God could work supernaturally on behalf of his child, it seems reasonable that he would have connected the dots, doesn't it? But if he believed, like so many people, that God really doesn't work on behalf of his people, not really, that it's possible it never would have occurred to him to seek after Elisha on behalf of his boy. Still, for whatever reason, it's clear that he couldn't imagine any reason at all to seek after the man of God at any time outside the normal festivals. And I think that's why the wife gives him the answer that she does. At first blush, in our English translations, it appears that she could be lying to him. She says, "It's all right." But everything isn't all right, is it? Her son is dead. Why would you say such a thing? Well, our English translations are accurately translating the original languages. They're not actually giving us the sense of what was said. I think it would be better to translate her expression, "It's fine, fine." In other words, she was answering her husband in the shortest way possible without intending to give him any information whatsoever. And we do this all the time, don't we? "How you doing?" "I'm fine." We're not fine. But the fact is, we don't want to talk about it. So we give a short answer that provides no information, but closes down the conversation. And that's exactly the way it is here. This was just an obligatory response because his statement demanded a response. But in reality, she didn't want to talk to him at all. She was in too much of a hurry. The only person she wanted to talk to was the man of God. So she saddled the donkey. And again, this is a small detail, but I find it interesting because it indicates that she wasn't willing to wait on some unmotivated servant to get around to it. She was eager to do all she could herself in order to hurry the process along. She tells the servant leading the donkey basically to go as fast as you can. Don't worry about me. Don't slow down unless I tell you. And the two of them set off at a brisk walk for Mount Carmel. Elisha is the one that sees her first, and he recognizes her from a distance. And again, this shouldn't be considered unusual because this probably wasn't the first time she'd gone to Mount Carmel. The words of her husband imply that she went to Mount Carmel for festivals on the new moon and various Sabbaths. Still, Elisha senses immediately something that's wrong because she's making a long trip on a day other than expected, and obviously she is in a hurry. So he tells his servant Gehazi to run and find out if she's all right, if her husband's all right, if her son's all right. And she answers Gehazi the same way she answers her husband. It's fine. In other words, she didn't want to talk to an underling. And she certainly didn't want to tell the story twice. So she gives the shortest possible answer that provides as little information as possible. But the story is different when she finally reaches Elisha. She jumps off her donkey, runs to the prophet, falls at his feet, and grabs his ankles. Gehazi evidently found this an affront against the dignity of the prophet and rushes in to push her away. Her obvious distress didn't matter. It didn't move him. There were protocols to be followed after all. And this lack of compassion on the part of Gehazi might be one of the reasons that she didn't want to talk to him in the first place. But Elisha, as a man of God, has more pity and certainly more understanding than his servant. He tells Gehazi to leave her alone because she's in bitter distress, and the Lord has kept the reason from her. Now, we aren't exactly sure why the Lord kept this information from Elisha, but this much is clear. He wanted the prophet to hear the situation directly from the woman's mouth. I suspect the reason for this is that if the Lord had told Elisha the situation in advance, he wouldn't have heard her voice choked with emotion. He wouldn't have heard her deep distress. He wouldn't have been able to enter in as deeply the feelings of this woman that he obviously cared about. Anyone who has ever suffered great sorrow will tell you that grief doesn't allow a lot of words. Overwhelming heartbreak and anguish of soul stifle our ability to speak. And so the woman doesn't directly reveal her grief. Instead, she indicates the nature of her trouble in the rebuke. She speaks only 2 sentences, but these 2 sentences communicate volumes. She says, basically, in essence, did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Did I make a complaint of my childlessness? When you offered me a son, did I leap at the offer? No, I did not. I said, don't lie to me, don't deceive me. But now you've done worse than deceive me, because that's a greater misery to have a child and lose him than to never have had one at all. At least that's the way she sees it. And I'm not sure, but this sudden change in situation appears to leave Elisha shaken. He acts immediately, almost impulsively. Something's got to be done, and it's got to be done right now. So he tells Gehazi to take his staff and run to the woman's house. And he is the one that could have got there the quickest. He tells his servant not to speak to anyone along the way. In other words, don't pause for conversation, no matter how brief. This is a matter of utmost urgency. Just keep running. And when you get there, lay my staff on the boy's face. But this isn't good enough for the mother. She tells Elisha that she's not going to leave him. And again, this is evidence of her amazing faith. She had resolved in her heart that she would not be content with anything less than bringing the prophet face to face with her dead child. And she wasn't going to leave until he came with her. So Elisha follows the woman back to her house, as he undoubtedly intended to do all along. But if she hadn't had the faith to seek out him in the first place, then that journey never would have been made. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. Well, let's go on in the story a little bit. The next scene is really just one verse long, verse 31. Bonnie, please.
Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, "The boy has not awakened."
Okay, now, as we mentioned before, we don't know how old Gehazi is when he becomes Elisha's servant. But the evidence is quite good that he's considerably younger than Elisha. I say this because Gehazi is able to make the trip to the woman's house and back before Elisha can make it once. And the facts of Gehazi's attempt to raise the boy are quite simple. He does exactly as Elisha has commanded, but the boy remains dead. So Gehazi travels back to Elisha, meets him on his way to the woman's house, and tells him the news. Now, the more interesting question is this: why did Gehazi fail? Some suggest that God is pleased to allow miracles through human beings, but not through lifeless objects. But that answer doesn't stand up to investigation at all. We read in chapter 13 of 2 Kings that after Elisha was dead, his bones resuscitated a dead man. In Acts 19, we read that handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched Paul were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. So that can't be the answer. I think, well, others suggest that there was a problem with Elisha. He never should have sent Gehazi in the first place. It was his job, not Gehazi's, to perform miracles. Other people suggest that Gehazi had a serious flaw in his character, and that prevented him from being used by God. After all, it is by faith women receive back their resurrection, their dead by resurrection. Faith had a lot to do with this. But what are we to conclude? It's true that Gehazi did have a flaw in his character, but we don't see it here. We see it much later on. Well, again, I think the answer is found in Hebrews 11:35. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. In other words, the necessary ingredient, if we want to put it that way, for raising this boy back to life was faith. So apparently it was Gehazi's lack of faith that was the problem. Now, this isn't mere speculation, because so we have some evidence in the text that this is the problem. Notice, first of all, that there's no mention of Gehazi praying during his attempt. Elisha prays, but Gehazi doesn't. Second, notice that Gehazi makes just one attempt and then he gives up. Unlike Elisha, there's no perseverance in his efforts to raise the boy. And one gets the distinct impression that Gehazi never expected it to work in the first place. That's why the author of Hebrews tells us that by faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. And it certainly appears that Gehazi had no faith. Well, let's look at the final scene in this story, verses 32 to 37, Bonnie.
When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on the couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out upon him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out upon him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." And he did. When she came, he said, "Take your son." She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out.
All right, thank you, Bonnie. Now, when we reach this section of the story, one is struck with how the story is written. When Elisha reached the house, the dead boy was lying on his couch. Now, notice he wasn't lying on a couch, but he's lying on his couch. In other words, the responsibility of the boy's life is laid directly at Elisha's feet. He is the one that promised the child, even when the woman didn't ask him for him. And now the child is dead. And by placing the dead boy on Elisha's couch, the woman is saying, in essence, look, this boy is your responsibility. This is a problem of your making. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, whenever we're faced with difficulty, the first thing we should do, I think we'll all agree, is pray, right? Mm-hmm. We don't always do that, but we always should do that. I think we can agree. That's what Elisha does. We aren't told what Elisha prays, but I strongly suspect that Elisha prays exactly what Elijah prayed in a similar circumstance. "Oh Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." It seems reasonable to assume that Elisha prays the same prayer, because Elisha does exactly what Elijah did in 1 Kings 17, when Elijah raised the widow's son to life. Elijah stretched himself out on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, and he stretched himself out on the boy, and the boy's body began to grow warm. This is exactly what Elijah had done, and Elisha copies him. But even though warmth begins to return to the dead boy's body, there's still no sign of life. So Elisha gets up and walks around the room back and forth several times. We aren't told what he's doing while he's walking, but I think the obvious answer is that he's praying. Regardless, whatever Elisha is doing as he's walking around, when he's finished, he lays back down on the boy as before. The boy sneezes 7 times, showing the recovery of a suspended respiration, and then he opens his eyes. I don't know if this means anything or not, but I do think it's worth at least noticing in passing that it took Elijah 3 times to raise the widow's son, while it only took twice for Elisha to do the same thing. I don't know what that tells us, but it is something that should be observed all the same, I think. Well, from this point forward, the story goes just like you'd expect it to. Elisha calls his servant in and tells him to summon the mother. When she comes in, Elisha tells her to take her son. But before she obeys that command to take her son, notice, she falls at Elisha's feet, as she did when she met him on Mount Carmel. Only this time, there's no complaint, only thanksgiving. And only after she had given thanks did she take her son and leave. And so we come again to the end of this great story of faith. The faith of the mother, the lack of faith of the servant, the faith of Elisha. Just like the author of Hebrews tells us, by faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. As I was reviewing this passage of scripture this week, I was reminded that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world, rising 29,035 feet above sea level. On May 29th, 1953, two men were able to reach the summit, Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary. And both of them became very famous for that accomplishment. By 1970, 24 climbers have reached the top. Since then, another 800 climbers successfully made it to the summit, more than 1,460 times. A record was set in 2002 when 54 people conquered Everest on the same day, with many more waiting below at the base camps. And the story of conquering Mount Everest teaches us an important truth. In life, someone always has to go first, and then others will follow the example. The author of Hebrews uses this as an example of faith. By faith, women received back their dead by resurrection. In other words, we see this. They went before us, and now we should act as they do. And the only question really is, will we follow their example? Any questions or comments at this moment before we leave Sunday school today? All right, then let's bow in prayer. Father, I thank you for this great story of Elisha showing such great faith. Help us, oh God, by seeing this example, to follow it and to act as he did, maybe not in such a spectacular way, but nevertheless, to have faith that if chapter 11 was still being added to in Hebrews, our names would be in it. Dismiss us now as we go into the morning worship service, that we would indeed worship you in spirit and in truth, for these are the worshipers you seek. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, beloved, we'll see you next week, God willing it.
All right. Have a good week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.